it's a description of a really brutal attack by the Sarah secret security police, who were called PIDE, P-I-D-E. And I think what's remarkable about the scene is not just that sort of punctuation-free style, but we see this event, we see this brutal attack from the perspective of some ants, which are sort of trundling across the cell floor. That somehow highlights the kind of brutality and the banality of that act. In between these four whitewashed walls on this tiled floor, notice the broken corners, how some tiles have been worn smooth, how many feet have passed this way. And look how interesting this trail of ants is, travelling along the joins as if they were valleys, while up above, projected against the white sky of the ceiling and the sun of the lamp, tall towers are moving. They are men, as the ants well know, having for generations experienced the weight of their feet and the long, hot spout of water that falls from a kind of pendulous external intestine. Ants all over the world have been bound or crushed by these, but it seems they will escape this fate now, for the men are occupied with other things. Let's take this ant, or rather, let's not, because that would involve picking it up. Let us merely consider it because it is one of the larger ones, and because it raises its head like a dog. It's walking along very close to the wall, together with its fellow ants. It will have time to complete its long journey 10 times over between the ant's nest and whatever it is that it finds so interesting, curious, or perhaps merely nourishing in this secret room. One of the men has fallen to the ground. He's on the same level as the ants now. We don't know if he can see them, but they see him, and he will fall so often that in the end they will know by heart his face, the colour of his hair and eyes, the shape of his ear, the dark arc of his eyebrow, the faint shadow at the corner of his mouth. And later, back in the ant's nest, they will weave long stories for the enlightenment of future generations, because it is useful for the young to know what happens out there in the world. The man fell. The others dragged him to his feet again, shouting at him, asking 2 different questions at the same time. How could he possibly answer them even if he wanted to? Which is not the case, because the man who fell and was dragged to his feet will die without saying a word. Only moans will issue from his mouth, and in the silence of his soul, only deep sighs. And even when his teeth are broken and he has to spit them out, which will prompt the other 2 men to hit him again for soiling state property, even then the sound will be of spitting and nothing more, that unconscious reflex of the lips, and then the dribble of saliva thickened with blood that falls to the floor, thus stimulating the taste buds of the ants, who telegraph from one to the other news of this singularly red manna fallen from such a white heaven. The man fell again. It's the same one, said the ants. The same ear shape, the same arc of eyebrow, the same shadow at the corner of the mouth. There's no mistaking him. Why is it that he's always the same man who falls? Why doesn't he defend himself, fight back? The ants are surprised, but only fleetingly. After all, they have their own duties, their own timetables to keep. It's quite enough that they raise their heads like dogs and fix their feeble vision on the fallen man to check that he is the same one, and not some new variant in the story. The larger ant walked along the remaining stretch of wall, slipped under the door, and some time will pass before it reappears to find everything changed. Well, that's just a manner of speaking. There are still 3 men there, but the 2 who do not fall never stop moving. It must be some kind of game. There's no other explanation. They grab him by the shoulders and propel him willy-nilly in the direction of the wall, so that sometimes he hits his back, sometimes his head, whilst his poor bruised face smashes into the whitewash and leaves on it a trace of blood. Not a lot, just whatever spurts forth from his mouth and right eyebrow. And if they leave him there, he, not his blood, slides down the wall, and he ends up kneeling on the ground beside the little trail of ants who are startled by the sudden fall from on high of that great mass, which doesn't in the end even graze them. And when he stays there for some time, one ant attaches itself to his clothing, wanting to take a closer look, the fool. It will be the first ant to die, because the next blow falls on precisely that spot. The ant doesn't feel the second blow, but the man does. I just think that it's such a wonderfully distancing approach to that scene, rather than describing in gruesome detail the bruising and the blood and everything else. we see the ant's view, and we see how ridiculous and absurd it is for two human beings, to treat another human being like that. I think in reducing punctuation down to commas and full stops, in allowing a sentence to follow the natural digressions of thought, I think he cuts himself free from conventional realistic literature, and he carries us along, I think, on those thought processes and those digressions. And he often uses we, so we become part of that narrative. So although, he is often, Saramago is the omniscient, godlike narrator, he often sort of pulls us into that same omniscience, I suppose. As I said before, I think when you read Saramago, you become carried along on that great wash of prose, and you feel part of what is being revealed to you, the reader. And I can't help seeing that, and I think he saw this approach to punctuation and narration as he was a lifelong, what he called an anarcho-communist. There's not a lot of those around anymore, I don't think. He was also a declared atheist, and he got into trouble with the Portuguese government with the Gospel according to Jesus Christ, which is a retelling of the story of Jesus, and in particular the story of his father, actually, Joseph. And for me it's a deeply humane book, but obviously God does not come out well. And this got him into trouble, and the Portuguese government refused to enter the book for a prestigious European prize, and José Saramago left Portugal and went to live in Lanzarote with his Spanish wife, Pilar. But I think he was a lifelong anti-authoritarian. He hated what he thought was sort of blind, stupid authority, and he was for the individual entirely. And I think he didn't like America, I have to say. And probably America doesn't like him. Because of that. Communists, not popular here, really. I mean, apart from among other communists, I think he wrote a wonderful book called The Cave, which is a family of potters. And they're set in opposition to this great, sort of super shopping mall, which is also becoming a kind of community. And the idea is that shopping mall is going to absorb the whole of humanity, and they're all going to be reduced to shopping. That's it. Shopping and watching television. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? The novel is one in which almost nothing happens really. But what it is about, really, is about relationships, about human relationships, and how those take priority over everything else, really, and how he saw consumerism really as as Plato's cave. It's just the shadows on the wall. It's not real. The thing that is real is how you relate to other people. And so I think that's really what makes him stand out so much for me as a writer. He's intensely humane. He's a very satirical writer, but he's very, very humane. And in his sort of assault on authority figures, he stopped giving proper names to people, and he also stopped capitalizing names. So in The Elephant's Journey and in Cain, no proper names are italicized at all. And it has the sort of consequence that you get kings and elephants, and gods and nations, prophets and outcasts. They're all equal because they're all lowercase. It's a sort of typographical revolution. It's very useful. People often seem very alarmed by the length of sentences. There's a kind of, I don't know what it is, but ever since Henry James, people have turned against long sentences. And personally, I think they're lovely, and I just don't, a lot of contemporary writers have very short sentences, and I find that very unsatisfactory somehow. Maybe because I translate Saramago and I translate Javier Marias, who both deal in long sentences. But I don't really see why, And people say, oh, English, can't cope with long sentences like that, with the subordinate clauses, but it copes perfectly well. It just takes a little reorganisation. I always, when I talk about Saramago, I always want to point out that I'm not the first translator of Saramago. Giovanni Pontiero, who was a Scottish man of Italian descent, hence his name, he was his first translator, and he's really the person who brought Saramago to the attention of the English reading world. Alas, he died far too young, and he was just finishing his translation of Blindness. And so, it was a kind of horrible good luck for me, because Giovanni died, and then the publisher asked me to take up the baton, I suppose. And the first Saramago novel I ever translated was All the Names, which is, I think, maybe because it was my first Saramago novel, it's still my favourite. And again, it's to do with the little man rising up against authority. It's set in the Central Registry of births, marriages and deaths of some ambiguous and unnamed city, which is probably them. And the archive holds the record cards for all the residents of the city, stretching back endlessly into the past. The protagonist is named Señor José, and he's the only character to be given a name. The others are all referred to as the old woman, the unknown woman, or the registrar. And Señor José is about 50 years old. He's a clerk in the registry, and he's sort of never had a life, really, apart from that. His whole life has been being a clerk, and the house he lives in is actually attached to the Central Registry. So he's sort of bound, umbilically bound to the Central Registry. But he has a door through which he can enter the Central Registry. He's not supposed to go through that door. When he goes to work, he has to go out of his house and round to the front and into the front door. But one night actually, he goes through that door because his hobby is collecting information about famous people, celebrities. And he decides he wants to look at the birth certificate of one of these famous people. So he goes into the Central Registry at night when no one else is there. And he has to climb up this very, very high ladder in order to get to this particular birth card. They're huge, it's huge, it's right up to the ceiling, And he inadvertently takes the wrong card. And the card is of a woman he doesn't know, he doesn't know who she is, she's not anyone significant. But he becomes, for reasons which are never explained, he becomes totally obsessed with finding out who she is, finding out about her life. And he never doesn't take the sort of the sensible route. Someone says, why don't you just look it up in the phone book? But no, he doesn't want to do that. And so he ends up sort of breaking into a school that she used to work at. She was a student. To break into the school, he climbs up a ladder and through a roof and through a skylight, and he's horribly bruised and battered by this. And it's a novel which, I think it's the last novel in which there's really this wonderful poetic prose. It's full of darkness and rain. And I just give you some quotes describing the darkness and the rain. He talks about a waiting, stagnant darkness, thick and silent as the ocean deeps. A darkness thick and absolute as is swathed in black cloths. A fine, almost diaphanous rain, a swirling confusion of drops, a great torrent raging noisily along the pavement. It's an intensely un-Mediterranean kind of atmosphere, but it's so evocative. And the Central Registry is really the labyrinth into which Señor José sets off. He has to go into it several times because in his search for the unknown woman, he has to set off, and he sets off with a piece of string tied around his ankle so he won't get lost. Because it really is a labyrinth. And it's called Ariadne's Thread, so the references are obvious. But there are many descriptions of his sort of excursions into the Central Registry, and this is just one, which I like very much. One might ask why Senor José needs a 100-yard-long piece of string if the length of the Central Registry, despite successive extensions, is no more than 80. That is the question of a person who imagines that one can do everything in life simply by following a straight line, that it is always possible to proceed from one place to another by the shortest route. Perhaps some people in the outside world believe that they have done so, but here, where the living and the dead share the same space, sometimes in order to find one of them you have to make a lot of twists and turns. You have to skirt around mountains of bundles, columns of files, piles of cards, thickets of ancient remains. You have to walk down dark gullies between walls of grubby paper which up above actually touch. Yards and yards of string will have to be unravelled, left behind, like a sinuous, subtle trail traced in the dust. There is no other way of knowing where you have to go next. There is no other way of finding your way back. There is an enormous difference between visiting the archive of the dead in normal working hours with the presence behind you of your colleagues who, although not particularly supportive, as we have seen, would always come running if there was any real danger, or if your nerves suddenly irresistibly failed. Especially if the registrar said, go and see what's happened to him. Yeah. Between that and venturing alone in the middle of a black night into the heart of those catacombs of humanity, surrounded by names, hearing the whisper of the papers or a murmur of voices for those who have ears to hear. So Saramago combines this wonderful, light, sort of wry humour, with real emotion and real feelings. And each of his books, he's an immensely imaginative writer, and each of his books is, each plot is completely different. So, and a lot of his novels spring from the question, what if? So, there's the Stone Raft, is, what would happen if the Iberian Peninsula broke away from the rest of Europe? Yeah. What if a plague of blindness was visited on a country? What if people dutifully went to polling stations only to enter blank ballot papers? What if people stopped dying? What if you met your physical double? And all those wonderful questions, they produce really extraordinary plots. And each book is utterly different. And each book is, intensely Saramago as well. He was obviously, as I've said, he was a very political writer. But he always gives equal and possibly more weight to human relationships. I think it seems to me that, according to me, it's how we relate, it's how we relate or fail to relate that makes the difference. And in, for example, his wonderful novel, The Year of the Death of Ricardo, he brought to life Ricardo, who was one of Fernando Pessoa, the great Portuguese poet, one of his heteronyms or alter egos. And Reis, he's incapable of love. And so he dies never having loved anyone, and his life is seen as a kind of sterile failure. In Blindness, which is an extraordinary novel, this is the novel in which the country is struck by a plague of white blindness that afflicts everyone except the wife of a doctor. And for the most part, the population behaves very badly. And it's what happens when there are no restraints on people. And so they plunder and they rape and they kill. But what shines out is the tolerance and kindness of the doctor's wife and the group of people that she quite accidentally gathers around her. Towards the end of the book, they finally find somewhere, a house to move into. They're terribly dirty, they haven't washed in weeks. And one morning the doctor's wife wakes up and she hears the sound of rain. And so she decides this is a good opportunity to go out there and wash their clothes and wash themselves. She quickly took off her drenched dressing gown, and now receiving on her body sometimes a caress, sometimes the whiplash of the rain, she began to wash the clothes and herself at the same time. The sound of water surrounded her, prevented her from noticing right away that she was no longer alone. At the door of the balcony stood the girl with dark glasses and the wife of the first blind man. We cannot tell what presentiments, what intuition, what inner voices might have aroused them, nor do we know how they found their way here. "Help me," said the doctor's wife when she saw them. "How, since we cannot see?" asked the wife of the first blind man. "Take off your clothes. The less we have to dry afterwards, the better." Perhaps In the building opposite, behind those closed windows, some blind people, men, women, roused by the noise of the constant beating of the rain, with their head pressed against the cold window panes, covering with their breath on the glass the dullness of the night, remember the time when, like now, they last saw rain falling from the sky. They cannot imagine that there are, moreover, 3 naked women out there, as naked as when they came into the world. They seem to be mad. They must be mad. People in their right mind do not start washing on a balcony exposed to the view of the neighbourhood, even less looking like that. What does it matter that we are all blind? These are things one must not do. My God, how the rain is pouring down on them, how it trickles between their breasts, how it lingers and disappears into the darkness of the pubis, how it finally drenches and flows over the thighs. Perhaps we have judged them wrongly, or perhaps we are unable to see that this is the most beautiful and glorious thing that has happened in the history of the city.